Welcome everyone to this Cumbria Woodlands webinar on the Ecological Site Classification, ESC, and Forest Development Types, FDTs. We're lucky enough to have with us Jens Haufe today, who's going to present for the majority of the session. I'm just going to give you a quick introduction here before I hand over to Jens. What will happen is please use the chat to ask questions. There's quite a lot of you, so I think it's probably best if that's the route you use for taking questions. I'm going to monitor the chat as we go, and once Jens is finished presenting, I'll have selected some questions, and Jens, I'll ask you the questions from the chat. Depending on the amount of questions, we won't have time to answer them all, but I'll try and choose a selection that's representative. Okay, so there's no spoilers, but ecological site classification, most of you might be aware of that. I've been using that for most of my career, and it's been a really useful tool, but it's always good to have a refresher, understand why we use it, how we use it, and the limitations of it particularly. The forest development types, I'm really excited to learn more about those. I've had a look at them. They seem sort of a great tool, and I'm excited to learn how we can apply those to do some really innovative forestry. And I think maybe they're a tool to give us a bit of confidence and also a tool to help us explain some of our thinking to clients or funders or the general public. So it's worth saying as well before we start that this webinar is brought to you by Cumbria Woodlands. The funding for this comes from a project that's done in collaboration with the Lake District Foundation. So Cumbria Woodlands and the Lake District Foundation received a grant from Heritage Lottery Fund, which originated from DEFRA and the Forestry Commission. And we've been using this money to do actions such as this webinar that aim to improve the quality and quantity of woodland creation and management in Cumbria, but also we've spread that a little bit beyond Cumbria, particularly in a situation like this where it's a freely available webinar. So the last thing I think before we get started is I'm going to ask you to interact with a thing called Mentimeter, which is just basically me taking advantage of a captive audience to gather a little bit of data. It's only 4 or 5 questions. So if you look in the chat, you'll see a link. You can hit that link. That'll take you to the Mentimeter. I'll also, I'm going to share this as well and present. And you'll see a QR code here. If you've got your phone on you, you can scan that QR code. That'll take you to the questions, or you can go to menti.com and use this code here. People have started to do it already, so that's great. The first question is just where you're from. This will give us all an indication of where we're all tuning in from. It's good, at least Cumbria is the biggest in the centre there. So we've got our target audience in Cumbria, but we've got quite a wide range of people here today. Might be being overtaken by Northumberland, never mind. Did I see Peru? God's own country, great. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question. What's your job? You can put anything. I think there's 3 choices here, so you can put if you've got more than one job or you want to define it in a number of different ways. Thanks very much. Really simply, Have you used ESC before? Have you used the forest development types before? I think finally, how did you hear about this webinar? There should be a free text box. And if you saw it in multiple places, we're interested to know as well. That's great. Thanks very much. This last question is one that I like. I just put it in all the time because I want to know where people's priorities are. Sort of, we've got to acknowledge that we have biases here and there, and these are the sort of pillars of sustainability. And please don't put 100% for each one, unless, if you truly feel like that, that's fine. You can select your personal priorities as I think most of us are foresters and agents. And I like watching a horse race. Okay, great. Thanks very much for humoring me. Jens, I'm going to turn my camera and microphone off now, if that's okay with you, so I'm not just sitting there like a numpty while you present. And then I'll keep an eye on the chat and I'll have some questions for you at the end now. So over to you. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much. I put my mic on and start sharing then. And I very much hope everybody is seeing the title slide of the presentation now. Yeah, first of all, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this rather late and unusual hour for a training course. We'll see how it goes. It's, yeah, one of those unusual little challenges. Ecological site classification, obviously, that is something I'm fairly well aware of. I use it, yeah, almost every week in my day-to-day life. Forest development types is something I help developing. So it is was actually quite a pleasant challenge to try and bring the two together. So I'll try and keep this fairly short and snappy. So it's only 20 something slides or so, so it shouldn't take ages. And I think, yep, I go straight into it. I saw on the initial poll, some of you had never used ecological site classification. It is something we invented, or well, we actually borrowed from Canada. So it was based on a Canadian system in British Columbia. I think the first version came out in 2001. At the moment, we're at version 4. You can apply it to plantations, to NVC types, non-wooded lands. It is a very good system. It is, as Lochlan alluded to, very useful, but it is also very much limited by the quality of input information. So that's why I thought we'd better start with looking at what's actually going in there. And the input variables, they are the climate, they are the geology, topography goes in there, soil information, and of course, in the processing this information, a lot of knowledge on plant ecology, tree nutrition, other silvicultural aspects are required. The outcome is suitability predictions, either for single tree species or for NVC woodland communities, or more recently for forest development types. So essentially, you tell the computer where you are in the countryside, and the computer tells you what would be a good idea to plant in terms of tree species. Or is it not quite that simple? So the climatic factors are all based on mathematical models, so based on Met Office data. So obviously we can only have so many meteorological stations. The climate data that goes into it, it's essentially 4 variables. The first one is warm. It's the accumulated average day temperature above a 5 degrees centigrade threshold. And depending on how many day degrees you accumulate over the year, you'll call your climate either subalpine, cool, warm, or very warm, depending again where you are, high up you are on the hillside, how far north, how far east, west, or south you are in the country. The second big factor is wetness. Wetness is measured as moisture deficit. It is actually the evaporation minus the rainfall. So again, you can imagine a fair amount of modeling goes in here. Rainfall needs to be interpolated between Met Office stations. Evaporation can only be modeled. And essentially, moisture deficit, the range goes from wet via moist, slightly dry to moderately dry. Moderately dry, if you have more than 260 millimeters deficit, that latter category only had to be introduced about 10 years ago in the context of climate change. So that's the 2 biggest factors, and they're usually put together in a matrix which looks like this. So you can sort your accumulated temperatures across and your moisture deficit down on the left, and that gives you 12 meaningful climate zones for forestry, plus 1 subalpine, which happens at the top of the Cairngorms where we don't practice forestry. So that's the biggest climate factors. We then, of course, also have the windiness, which is expressed in dams, which in total, I think it ranges from 3 to 36 within Britain. Dam score really reflects average wind speed plus likelihood of gale. It was actually calibrated with measuring tatter flags, which were put out at strategic positions, so essentially paper flags of which the wear and tear was monitored over a given period of time. So the faster the wear of the flag, the more exposed the area is. So the interesting part for forestry is probably the range between 12 and 22. Everything 12 or lower we actually call sheltered, so shouldn't pose any problems to forestry. And then, as you see, it goes slightly up into moderately, highly, and severely exposed until at scores above 22, it becomes too exposed for commercial forestry. It doesn't necessarily mean that trees won't grow there, but they're likely to grow in funny shapes. They may grow very slowly. The 4th factor is continentality. So the Conrad index is an expression for the fluctuation of mainly your rainfall and your temperature. You can imagine that accumulated temperature, that 85 index, you can arrive at exactly the same sum if you have a very mild winter and a very or a not so hot summer, but also if you have a very harsh winter and a very hot summer, they could essentially give you the same available temperature. But the continentality now will actually bring in an index of, well, how much does this vary between growing seasons, even between day and night? Of the climate factors, continentality is probably the least important one that matters for tree growth. So ecological site classification, it looks at continentality, but you get an idea from the map. The scale doesn't change on a local basis very much. Right, on the soil side, we have two main factors to look at. Soil nutrient regime is an expression for soil fertility, so ranging from very poor to very rich, plus carbonate as an add-on. And on the left-hand side, we have the soil wetness expressed as soil moisture regime from very wet to very dry. And in this matrix, we can actually sort most of our soil groups or soil types to give us an idea where we are in terms of soil fertility and soil wetness. We can also use the presence and abundance of indicator plant species to add a bit or to refine this a bit. The soil type, when you actually look at the squares, some of them are bigger than others, and some of them are, they look and they sound suspiciously similar. Yeah, brown earth, you see that actually ranges from poor right over to very rich. And from a soil type brown earth, you may not be able to actually say it is a calcareous one. You may be able to distinguish a gravelly or a sandy brown earth from a loamy one, but that is not really a guarantee that you can tell how fertile the soil is. So indicator plants are a very welcome addition to that. Indicator plants, there are 100 of them. They are sorted pretty much into the same grid. So we have, again, soil nutrient regime across the top. You notice carbonate fertility class is missing here, and soil moisture regime is on the left. Moderately dry and very dry are missing here simply because they are too poor for plant growth. And there are two ways that ESC can determine the soil nutrients or moisture regime on site. The recommendation is that at least 5 representative species are used. I've highlighted 6 species in here. And one way, the so-called shortcut method, is actually to locate them in this grid. So you see hard fern is sitting in the poor and moist, whereas foxglove is in the medium and moist. And then we have common bent in the poor and fresh box, and compact rush in the poor and very moist one. And finally, I've picked tormental in the very poor and very moist, and tufted hairgrass in the rich and moist. So if you pick at least 5 species and you consider the abundance of each species, you can kind of guesstimate a weighted average. So here, I would just look at my 6 boxes and think, yeah, whereabout is the center of gravity between those 3 double-ended arrows? And I'll probably say, yeah, in the poor, maybe bordering on the medium, and in the moist. So this would be my rather rough estimated soil moisture, soil nutrient regime. Plants have also been scored by scientists, and in Bulletin 124, which is the one on ecological site classification, you actually find a table for 100, well, all the indicator species which are shown in this matrix. That table gives a score for each plant. And then again, how your plants score on average, you can fall into one of those categories: very poor, poor, medium, rich, and very rich. Again, a quick worked example with the very same plant species. So foxglove, hard fern, tormental, compact rush, common bent, and tufted hairgrass are all here. So you see the SNR scores in the second column, the estimated abundance. It's not rocket science, it is an educated guess looking at how much ground they cover. So you multiply the two, so you get a product, and of course you have the abundance. You add both up together, and then you divide the product by the sum of total coverage. So in this case, 108 divided by 15, we can skip the 10. And that again gives us Now, this time it's not a guesstimate, this time it's a proper weighted average of 7.2. And again, that would stick us into the poor fertility class, maybe slightly leaning on the medium side. So that is essentially the ways how to estimate soil fertility. Now, if you use the ESC online, so the decision support system, the primary user input required is really just a 6-digit Ordnance Survey grid reference. So wherever you are in the country, 6 digits, so precision down to plus minus 100 meters. And that gives you a valid ESC output. However, the suitability predictions are really based just upon reference to latitude, longitude. There is a digital elevation model which gives you altitude, and of course all sorts of maps. There could be soil maps, there could be British Geological Survey geological maps. They usually, at best, they come at a scale in 1 in 50,000. If you have soil maps, standard is again 1 in 50,000. If you are lucky enough, if you work on the National Forest Estate, more likely if you are in Scotland, much less so if you're in England and Wales. It really depends where exactly you are. You may actually get a soil map at 1 in 10,000 resolution, but that is the exception rather than the rule. National Forest Estate, they started mapping the estate in the 1970s, and they never finished it. And they predominantly started in the north. So Scotland is much better mapped than England and Wales. And in England and Wales, basically the further south you go, the worse it gets. But if you're not on the NFE, then you won't get a 1 in 10,000 map either. And ESC quite simply looks at a 1 in 50,000 scale soil map or geological map. And you can imagine how accurate that is. So our ESC output, the method with which ESC works this out, it's fine for climate data. Now, for climate data, there is quite simply nothing better that is available. So you get climate needs to be based on mathematical models and ESC. The models are sound and they are accurate enough. However, it is nowhere nearly accurate and precise enough for soil data. Now, certainly a 1 in 50,000 map, that is, you probably wouldn't even use that for a hill walk. You would go for something at a smaller scale. And certainly if you think about afforesting or choosing tree species for an afforestation site, where you think, yeah, soil types could actually change quite quickly within a few meters, that simply won't be reflected. And even in areas where you have 1 in 10,000 soil maps, even surveyors have been known to make mistakes. So let alone from actually modeling errors and other mistakes which are made. So what I'm really saying here is the ESC internal calculation process from that 6-digit grid reference to give you climate data. There's nothing wrong with that, but to give you soil fertility and soil moisture, that is a guess at best. However, there are other options. So you can actually override or you can actually put in secondary information. You can actually put in the soil nutrient on soil moisture regime directly. ESC allows you to do that, so you can quite simply overwrite the default values. You can also choose to actually put the soil type in directly. You can put in indicator plants, you can put in water table level, you can put in soil phases, you can put in humus layer. So there's actually quite a few options where you can say you can increase the accuracy and precision of your forecast. And I'm going to go through these methods in detail in a few moments. What they all have in common, they do of course require direct assessment on site. Your grid reference, you can do that from your desk, and you can type that into ESC. That's no big deal. Your soil, if you really want to know how wet it is, how fertile it is, what plants are growing there, you need to be out on site and you need to carry a spade and poke around a bit. But if you do that, then the reward for that is you get really a significant improvement in the quality of the ESC prediction. Right, so much for theory. I'm going to show you an example. So I have put in a grid reference here, and lazy as I was, I just went for the one that is suggested on the template, so NT 090950. So that takes us somewhere into Blair Adam Forest in Scotland. And straight away, if I use the default data, I get on top my climate information. So I get accumulated temperature, continentality, dam score, moisture deficit. And of course, I get my soil moisture regime. So it's moist. And I get a soil nutrient regime, rich. And as a consequence, I've only copied in the top of the table of suggested species. But you see the suitability column, all the pines are essentially fine, except for the more warmth-loving ones. So Corsican pine doesn't like the temperature, maritime pine doesn't like it, so they both just score a marginal, and radiata pine doesn't want to grow at all, but radiata pine also thinks the soil is too wet. Yeah, but otherwise you get pretty much green light, so suitable or very suitable. However, if you actually go to that site, find that grid reference, and you decide this is actually not moist and rich, you can actually go back into ESC and you can put in your soil moisture regime and your soil nutrient regime directly. So there's little drop-down menus, and you see here the default is on top of this, but of course you can choose any of the categories for soil moisture, and you can do the same for soil nutrient regime. And I've just changed them ever so slightly. Well, I've changed moist to wet, so that is 2 notches more towards waterlogging. And I've changed rich to poor. Again, that jumps the medium category. So basically, I've overwritten the default values in ESC. And straight away, you see they're shown here. Climate change, or climate data hasn't changed. But my soil moisture regime is now wet, soil nutrient regime is now poor. And you see of the very same species, I now have 4 species which are unsuitable, and I still have 2 which are marginal. So Scots pine and Corsican pine. Corsican pine, its temperature is the problem. Scots pine probably thinks it's too wet. But quite simply, a significantly different result just for a handful of species, just because I changed some of the internal input variables. And I hope that shows, and it's not uncommon that you're actually 2 grades out, that ESC suggests rich and you actually think, no, actually fertility is poor. Geological maps are only so accurate, and soil boundaries can change very quickly. So that is the direct input. You can also, as I mentioned before, you can input your soil survey and vegetation survey. Soil survey, if you click on that input soil survey underlined option, then it opens another window where you can specify your soil type. Again, I've only copied in some of the most more common main soil groups, but yeah, I think you can choose from all 50 soil types, which there are in UK's forest soil classification. So if you decide tell ESC you found a podzol there when you poked around. You see underneath you can even specify soil phases if they are present. That's for people who really know about our soil classification, but it can be easily done. You can do the same for the humus form, although that is much more coarse than soil types. So the humus form is usually only recommended to use if there are no plants that can give you a hint about how fertile the soil is. And for soil wetness, you can use the winter water table method, which is quite simply drilling a borehole. It needs to be something like 3 meters deep, and you measure the difference between the surface and the water table. And obviously, the less the difference is, the wetter the soil is. So 3 possible options to actually put soil data in directly if you don't think you can make that judgment how fertile your soil is and how wet your soil is. You can do the same for the vegetation survey. That quite simply opens a window where you can enter 5 indicator plant species, and in the abundance table you just type in the abundance as a percentage. And then I've used the same plants and the same abundance here. No, one less. I think I had to get rid of tufted hairgrass because ESC only accepts 5 indicator plants, and I think I had 6 in my direct assessment. But essentially the program can calculate your weighted average for you, although that is again not rocket science. That can easily be done manually. So that is 2 more options to actually put in information or site assessed information directly into ESC. The next one, I'm jumping back to the climate here. You also have the little well, it's inconspicuous sign options plus minus here. When you click there, you can filter results, which is fairly straightforward, but the more important one is the climate scenarios. There is again a drop-down menu, and you can choose between 3 scenarios: baseline climate, medium high emissions scenario for 2050, and the medium high emissions scenario for 2080. So you get on a time scale, you get 3 points, which you can use and may say, well, it's all right, I know that what the climate conditions are now, but I want to know if I'm planting something that still needs to be growing in 50, 60, 80 years, then will that still be suitable? Again, it's very straightforward. You pick the scenario you want to, and then you click on the update results button, and you'll get the scenarios. If you're wondering, there are 6 lines here. There's always a normal climate change scenario, and there is one with AWC. That stands for alternative water holding capacity. And if you pick one of the AWC options, it gives you a slightly more favorable conditions for tree establishment, because it is assumed that the trees in future, they will actually grow up under woodland climatic conditions. ESC was designed on the assumption, or based on the assumption, that we will, or that main management approach is clear fell and restock. So the default assumption in ESC is always clear fell, and then we get open ground conditions. Again, both from soil wetness and climatic conditions, and plants or trees find it much harder to establish themselves there. So the AWC essentially implies that you're going to use low impact management approaches, or CCF techniques. As you see here, the direct comparison, so I've put for the very same grid reference, so there's the baseline climate, and there's the 2080 high emission scenario. And whilst continentality doesn't change much, exposure doesn't change, moisture deficit does change a bit, so it is turning a bit drier, but it is turning quite a lot warmer, according to our current climate models. If you want to picture that into our climate matrix, so this is where our baseline climate is. So we are sitting in the top left corner of the cool and wet. And in 60 years' time, we are going to be firmly sitting in the warm and moist climate zone. So that is something that obviously needs to be considered when you think about choosing your tree species. And with that, we move on to forest development types. I obviously, due to the shortness of time, I really just focused on the site suitability of the forest development types. So this is the only slide which gives you a general impression what an FDT looks like. So there are 69 of them. They come in the shape of flashcards. So each card is basically one card of A4. And on the front side, you have a visualization what the stand structure might look like towards the end of the rotation. The green box gives you a bit of a stand structure and stand dynamics. So which species are involved, to what proportion, where is it likely to develop. You get, again, a double-ended arrow, which gives you a range of management options. How you could actually run this either as a clear fell and restock, or as a simple or as a complex continuous cover option, or as a what I normally refer to a tree farming option. So even aged and not thinned. The yellowish part is really the ecological suitability. So there's a text box which gives you some information on how related the FDT is to NVC types, how suitable it is to certain soil properties. There is, of course, the soil suitability. So there's our soil nutrient, soil moisture grid again. And there is the climate suitability, which gives you the suitability for temperature, moisture deficit, and exposure. And at the bottom, you have in the blue box some hints on management objectives. So what might be achievable with this FDT. On the reverse side of the sheet, you have a short paragraph about management principles. Quite a lot of the FDTs are actually mixtures. So management principles, it's not always plain sailing or business as usual. And then there is a management timetable, which should be interpreted as a checklist about what might be required doing at a certain stage of stand development. So that is really just an FDT in as a quick overview. The top bit, stand description, visualization, options for stand structure. I said you have these 4 options here, where I said tree farming, even aged, unthinned is the one on the left. Even aged, thinned is our standard clear fell and restock, and then we have uneven aged simple and uneven aged complex structures. So if you think about these options, clear fill and restock, they cover everything that is sitting on the left corner right over to the middle. Continuous cover forestry are the 2 uneven aged options, and lower intensity management approaches. They are kind of bridging the gap. They are the missing link between the 2. Lima approaches, they include some CCF methods, which well, for example, which wouldn't be accepted by CCF purists. Yes, if you think about seed tree methods, strip shelter wood, methods like these, where people might say, well, that's not really continuous cover forestry. Others may be a bit more generous and say, oh yeah, it is close enough. But Lima definitely also includes small-scale clear fell management. It may be useful to remember from a size, a coop size point of view, CCF, the maximum permissible coop size is 1/4 of a hectare. For Lima, it's actually 2 hectares, so you can be a bit more deliberate. And if you look at the numbers of FDTs for each of the options, you'll see that actually most FDTs imply, or at least include, options for low impact management or CCF. There are still almost 20 where you say, yes, you can plant, walk away, and come back 45 years later for clear felling. It will work, but the vast majority actually requires continuous management. And the same goes, of course, for the divide between single species stands and mixed species stands. They all have a certain proportion of minor species, so mixed stands, I've only counted those which also have a secondary species. So the next section where I say that is really the important one. So I've picked the same FDT here, Sitka spruce and beech. So you see a bit more closely what is actually shown in that section. And that is the bit that allows you to relate the FDT to your site quality. So bottom left, you actually have this climate chart, and the yellow box, which has just appeared, that really, it shows the climatic footprint where the FDT is deemed to be at least suitable. Yeah, so we haven't gone to that greater detail where we distinguish between very suitable, marginal, and unsuitable. With the forest development types, it's quite a simple binary division. It's either suitable or better, or it is unsuitable or worse. So wherever you are within that yellow box, this FDT, Sitka spruce and beech will actually work from a climatic point of view. And you have also somewhere the maximum permissible dams score shown in that chart. So what you need now is, of course, the information from ESC, which tells you, okay, we're in the cool and wet at the moment, and we'll be in the warm and moist in 60 years' time. So as we can see from a climatic point of view, there's absolutely nothing wrong with Sitka spruce and beech. They, at least from a climate change perspective, they have a future at Blair Adam Forest. If you look at ESC in the decision support system, so again, there's our outcome, our temperature, exposure, moisture deficit. The difference to the single tree species version of ESC, if you switch ESC into the forest development type mode, as I said, you don't get the detailed description on whether an FDT is very suitable, marginal, or unsuitable. You really just get that binary decision. It is either suitable or it isn't. So that's a bit of a loss of information. The upside is you get this information, or ESC will only return forest development types which are deemed suitable under the baseline climate, as well as under the 2050 and 2080 predictions. So what you see here on the window, that is all the FDTs which ESC returns as suitable. Remember, I changed the soil moisture regime to wet and the soil nutrient regime to poor. So it is actually quite harsh or relatively harsh conditions. But essentially what is in that orange square at the bottom, that is all the FDTs which are deemed suitable or better. But at least you won't have to check against future climates. It's all there at your fingertips, so you know immediately. Sitka spruce will work. Sitka spruce with light demanding conifers will work. Sitka spruce with beech, of course, won't work. I said it was suitable from a climatic point of view, but it won't be suitable from a soil moisture regime point of view. Yeah. And that is the second thing we need to check. We've done the climate. Now here on our soil matrix, again, we have a yellow box which shows the soil suitability footprint for the FDT. And here we see why actually Sitka spruce and beech failed, because the yellow box does not extend down to the wet conditions. It does cover the poor, but it doesn't go into the wet. Yeah. There is in FDTs, they actually do show another gray box behind the yellow box. And we've put that in for comparison. The gray box actually shows the soil footprint for the primary species only. When we developed, or when we put the forest development types into ESC, we were aware that people can actually now interrogate ESC in various ways. They can interrogate for individual species, but also for FDTs. And we thought people will do that. They might actually compare things, and whenever they end up with different results, there will be questions. So we thought it might be better if we actually show both results straight away. But obviously we're only showing it for the primary species, not for the secondary one. So essentially, the yellow box you get in the soils is the suitable range for the FDT. The gray one is the suitable range for Sitka spruce. And you see in this example that actually Sitka spruce has a much bigger footprint here. Yeah, Sitka spruce is recommended for any soil fertility from poor to very rich, and for any soil wetness from slightly dry to wet. The reason why the FDT has a different range, there's essentially two reasons for that. One is that the secondary species could actually have a different fertility. And sure enough, if you think about beech, it doesn't really like to go to the bottom end of the very moist range, and beech certainly doesn't want to grow in the wet. So that is the reason why the yellow box is actually shorter on the moisture range. It only goes down halfway across very moist, but it doesn't really go into the wet. The other reason is a bit silvicultural common sense. You see, the FDT, Sitka spruce and beech, is not recommended for very rich, but that has nothing to do that the species won't perform there. Obviously, Sitka spruce will perform there, and so will beech. We just thought if you're lucky enough to have a site with very rich fertility, it would not be the wisest decision to actually waste it on something that has Sitka spruce as the primary species. So that is basically why the yellow box doesn't really cover the very rich area, because we think you can actually do much better there. You could veneer grade oak, or sycamore or wild cherry, rather than just planting Sitka spruce and beech. So there are two reasons why the yellow and the gray box can be a bit different. It could be that the secondary species dictates a different range, and it could also be that silvicultural common sense would suggest, well, don't take the FDT to the extremities of the species range. I'll give you another example here, Scots pine and birch. Here it's, well, straight away you see the grey box for Scots pine halfway across very poor, and it goes right over to very rich. But again, for the very same reasons, if you have very rich, even medium fertility sites, you can do so much better than to plant Scots pine and birch. So this is why the yellow box actually stops at poor. On the other side, the yellow box actually goes further into the very poor, because we think birch, being even less demanding than Scots pine, you could actually drag this FDT into poorer ground than we normally recommend for Scots pine. Yeah. So sometimes on a few FDTs, you'll actually find that the yellow box covers areas of soil fertility and wetness, where the grey box, which are not included in the grey box for the primary species. And again, this is for silvicultural common sense reasons. Right, so that is essentially the upshot of it. Forest development types are embedded in ESC decision support system, as are the single species. So when you load up ESC, you have the little drop-down window, and you can actually choose between tree species, NVC woodland types, or forest development types. And essentially what you get for your tree species version, you get the more accurate, or the more detailed scale, ranging from very suitable, marginal to unsuitable, but you only get a prediction for one point in time only. So you then need to toggle between different time scales. Yeah. Whereas if you go for the forest development type version, you only get the binary, you only get suitable or unsuitable. So it is a bit coarser, but you get that over the continuum of time. So whatever you are shown is suitable means it is suitable for the baseline climate, for the 2050 scenario, and for the 2080 scenario. And since forest development types have been primarily developed as a means of helping us to grow more diverse forests in the future, we thought this is actually the more valuable criterion when it comes to choosing between suitability detail and covering a wider time range. Right, yeah. Just, yeah, for the last time, the little warning, yeah, whichever version you use, tree species or forest development types, neither will actually give you very reliable results if you don't verify the default soil moisture, soil nutrient regime values in the field. Yeah, so as I said before, if you just work with the default data, you're giving away a lot of detailed information, which could actually lead to inaccurate and imprecise predictions by the model. Right, and I think that is all I meant to cover here. Thanks very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to see what questions we have.
Thanks, Jens. Got a couple of questions in the chat. I've answered a few directly, but there's one here from Ian, which is a really good question, and I never thought about it before. Is the fertilizer option in ESC based on just a handful of fertilizer at planting, or is it based on a comprehensive fertilizer regime over the life of the stand?
That is a good question, and I'm not sure whether I can answer that correctly. I think it is based on fertilization at establishment, but not on the fertilization regime over the life of the stand. I don't think that, so I think it is the former rather than the latter, but I would, to be absolutely sure, I would recommend contacting Forest Research. Stephen Bathgate is the one to answer these questions, but I strongly suspect it will be just a handful at establishment.
I hope so, because that's what I've always thought. The next question is from Esther Bloor, and it's: to what extent is the information on the FDT flashcards UK specific? Do you know of any other countries using something similar?
Yes, of course. The forest development types are nothing new, and we certainly didn't invent them. They've been about in Central Europe for several decades. I remember when I was at university in the 1980s, at least the precursor version of forest development type were out there. Yeah, so, and I think in Germany, they've been out since the 1990s. In other countries, I'm pretty sure Austria, Switzerland, Czech Republic, Poland, Central Europe, they have all the same. I do know Denmark introduced forest development types after 2005 for the very same reasons as we did in the UK. Yeah, so it is something that has been used elsewhere, that has been proven. And we actually modeled, or we based our version on a German template. But when it actually comes to the info, that is, of course, UK specific. So we didn't just go and copy and paste. We actually, the FDTs were developed. It was a 4-person working group, all forest research staff at the time. And we looked long and hard at and consulted other branches of forest research. So we made sure the FDTs were adapted to UK growth conditions. Yeah.
Great, thanks. This next question from RR, I can't tell what the full name is there, but I think it echoes my feeling around being told what to do by forest research and the FDTs. So the question is, does the FDT description page state whether the difference between the yellow and grey box coverage is due to differences in site suitability or silvicultural sense?
No, it doesn't.
But you can sort of guess, can't you? Because like you pointed out with the spruce and beech option, it's
Yeah.
only excluding it on the very rich. Well, so sort of a bottom wet and poor exclusion is probably a
Yes.
species thing, and a rich exclusion is probably a sense thing.
I would think that as a forester, you should be able to tell this. And if not, I mean, there is a way to find out. You can compare an FDT and then run ESC for the primary and the secondary species and see what ESC predicts for the species. But I also have to say, I didn't comment on it at all. ESC models the suitability predominantly by yield class. And so ESC tries to maximize biomass production for a forest. From a forester's point of view, that may actually not be your management objectives. Biomass production is only loosely linked to timber quality. So the fastest growing trees are not always producing the best timber quality. It depends on the tree species. It depends on a number of conditions. So as a forester, or even as a businessman, my objective is not always to achieve the highest possible yield class, certainly not for all species. So there is actually quite a number of things going in here, which have made us actually move the yellow box slightly away from the grey box. Yeah, ESC is really quite, if you go for the species, tree species version, ESC is quite ruthless. It will always favor what grows fastest, which is not necessarily, if you think about several other aspects, from carbon sequestration to steep slopes, there are quite a number of reasons why you think, well, you don't necessarily want the fastest growing tree species on the site.
Very good.
So I'm afraid, there was no way that we could include that into every FDT. So I think that is something. It is, after all, a tool for foresters. So, and there is training available, but it doesn't state itself.
That's great, thanks. The next question is: are more tree species and more FTTs being added to ESC in the future?
Well, species have been added to ESC in the last 10 years. I think until 2015 or so, ESC covered a mere 26 tree species. And in the light of climate change, forest research has undergone undertaken a large review of their tree species database, and at the moment there are 60 odd species in ESC, so that is a big jump. The same goes for forest development types. In the version 1.0 came out with 61 FDTs. In version 1.1 we have added 8, so at the moment we are at 69. So as for more tree species in ESC, I cannot tell, but I think I would suspect, yeah, forest research may actually add more there, but maybe not necessarily in a rush. Forest development types, yeah, certainly, if the demand is there, then I can easily see us adding more tree species. It's again, don't expect massive jumps. Yeah, even countries, if you think, I mentioned Denmark have about 25 FDTs only. Germany, it's different. Every German Bundesland has their own FDTs, and our template, we modeled it on the template of Lower Saxony, and I think they have 90 or so FDTs. So there is a kind of, you reach a saturation point at some stage. So I wouldn't expect lots more in the near future. But yeah, we're certainly, if new species mixtures become very common and turn out to be very suitable, they will be included there. Yeah.
That's the end of the chat questions, or is it? Let me just check. But I have a question, which is about which climate scenario to choose. So I'm just going to share my screen actually, because I think this might be helpful. So this is the landing page on ESC. And if you click this options button, you can choose a climate scenario. And the default is 1960 to 90, which actually the default probably shouldn't be that one. And I think I usually go somewhere in the middle of the road, but it's quite an uninformed choice. What should we be thinking about when we're choosing one of these, Jens? And do you have a preferred one?
I usually, well, I would say if you run ESC on the forest development types, you don't need to choose, because you actually are given all 3 time points in time. If you run it on a tree species base, I would choose the baseline and the 2080. I would actually run ESC twice.
Why is there two 2080s? What's the difference here? What's AWC?
Oh, but that was in the presentation. The AWC is the alternative water storage capacity scenario for the soil. And use the AWC if you think you will manage the site under low impact management or continuous cover. Whereas if you are confident it will be large scale clear fell, then use the normal one. Yeah, the AWC really assumes you maintain woodland climate, and that gives you a much more balanced soil moisture regime for the establishment, whereas clearfell and restock, you know, when you take all the trees off a site, your water table does funny things, and you're changing from sheltered woodland climate to very exposed open ground climate within a matter of months. So your climate conditions become actually quite a lot harsher for a lot of tree species to establish. So the AWC is quite simply use the AWC if you're confident you're going to use small scale clear fells or CCF. And only if you think, yeah, it will be a 5 hectare clear fell or bigger, then yes, go for the normal one.
That's great. That's really
but for individual trees, I would run the scenario twice, for baseline and for 2080.
On that note, James has asked, would AWC be more suitable for coppice management? Which seems like the answer to that is yes.
Yeah.
I'm going to take this opportunity that's the end of the chat questions, but I'm going to encourage everyone to think of a couple of more questions just while I do a quick tour of some options available through Cumbria Woodlands while I've got you here. So I'm going to share my screen again, and I'm going to highlight two things to you here. One is, well, thanks for coming to the webinar, and the best place to find out about this kind of opportunity is to go to the Cumbria Woodlands website, scroll right down to the bottom, and sign up to the newsletter by entering your email address into here. That's like a monthly email update, and it's just full of things like this, basically. The second thing I want to draw your attention to is, again, on the website under working with individuals, there's this platform called Canopy Learning. And on here, there's a whole host of online training opportunities you can sign up to. So I'd encourage you to have a look at that. You can get in touch with us as well on the website if you have any questions. So thanks for listening to that. And then there's just a question here, which is probably the last question, unless another one pops up. Oh no, it's a bit of information actually from David saying the baseline option of 1960 to 1990 seems to be out of date. Oh no, it's a question. Will the baseline option be revised in due course?
Yeah, good question. I know for a fact forest research staff are already working on implementing the 2018 data records. So I actually asked that myself from forest research, and I haven't had an answer yet. Yeah, I strongly suspect it may actually not be the 1960 to 1990 data, but actually something a bit more recent, and they may have just not relabeled it, but I don't know. And as I said, I've queried it. I've created forest research for that today, and I haven't had a reply yet.
That's great. Thanks very much. And just another note is I've dropped links to the FTTs, to ESC, and to the Cumbria Woodlands website in the chat there. And unless there are any further questions, I think that's all. So we've recorded the webinar and it'll be available on YouTube. We'll send out a link to this, but it's also available to anybody that wasn't here or didn't sign up as well. So yeah, thanks very much, Jens, and thanks everybody for coming.